On April 9th, 1865, the guns of the Civil War finally went quiet. Meeting in the spacious parlour of the home of Wilmer McLean in Appomattox, Virginia, the two most eminent generals at the time exchanged small talk and discussed the terms of surrender. Despite being known as Unconditional Surrender Grant, the Union general offered extremely favorable terms to his vanquished foe. After fighting until the bitter end, Confederate General Robert E. Lee was out of options. He was outnumbered, he was cornered, and his troops hardly had eaten in nearly a week. General Grant allowed the Army of Northern Virginia to return home on parole with their sidearms and their horses, along with a generous helping of rations to ease their hunger. To many, this marked the unofficial end of the American Civil War, but for others, this was just the beginning of a long ordeal. The war had been headed up by two warring presidents. The Union was led by Abraham Lincoln, perhaps the greatest leader in American history, while the South was headed by Jefferson Davis, a capable politician in his own right. On April 9th, many believed that a meeting between the two men was inevitable, but less than a week later, everything changed when a shot rang out at Ford's Theater, Washington, D.C., punctuated by the chilling words, "Sic semper tyrannis," there will always be tyrants. With the death of Abraham Lincoln, any hope for a peaceful dissolution of the Confederate government seemed to melt away. Jefferson Davis was connected to the assassination, and a generous reward of $100,000 was offered for his capture. There were many in the Union who were now determined to see Jefferson Davis tried for the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Meanwhile, Davis began a long trek south and further south. He was pushed out of Richmond after the Union armies closed the noose around the city, and he was deprived of his largest army and his best general by the events at Appomattox. So Davis took his closest advisors and allies and fled. Davis still hoped that he could reorganize the scattered remnants of the Confederate army and make a final bloody stand in the West, where most of the Union armies had vacated in a bid to besiege Richmond and trap Lee in the East. For April 9th onwards, Davis moved into southern Virginia and then through the Carolinas, and finally ended up in Georgia, where he was constantly pursued by Union cavalry, hoping to cash in on the bounty. On the morning of May 10, 1865, Davis was sleeping in a camp set up along a creek bed near Irwinville, Georgia, when he was awoken by the sound of gunfire. He emerged from his tent and found himself surrounded by cavalry of the 1st Wisconsin and 4th Michigan regiments. Davis was taken into custody, and many at the time believed that this was the beginning of the end of Jefferson Davis, but that proved not to be the case. Not only did Davis outlive his rival, Lincoln, but he would also outlive both President Andrew Johnson and President Ulysses S. Grant. Jefferson Davis somehow managed to escape the hangman's noose and live to the ripe old age of 81. But how? How did the leader of the United States' greatest rebellion manage to survive what seemed like a guaranteed death sentence? Why wasn't Davis prosecuted and sentenced to death for his crimes against the United States? Hello, everybody, and welcome to Forgotten and Found, a history podcast. I'm your host, Grant Piper, and today we're going to be talking about the puzzling fate of Jefferson Davis. The period directly following the American Civil War is one of the most turbulent and least understood in all American history. When the guns went silent at Appomattox, Jefferson Davis seemingly vanishes from the history books. Most people do not know what happened to the Confederate leader, and many understandably assume that he was hanged for his crimes, but he wasn't. In order to understand how remarkable this is, we need to look at some other prominent examples of people who were executed for treason against the United States. Many of these people were killed for far less than leading a full-scale rebellion against the country. So let us look at those who were not as fortunate as Davis, and then see what happened to Davis in the wake of his arrest in May of 1865. On October 16, 1859, radical abolitionist John Brown stole into Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He and a small band of like-minded ruffians cut the telegraph lines and arrested the watchman of the local armory. Indeed, it was the armory that was at the center of Brown's plans. The goal was to secure the armory and the nearby rifle factory in a bid to gain weapons for a slave uprising. With Harper's Ferry captured, Brown wanted to haul the weapons south to the nearby plantations and arm any slaves willing to fight for their freedom. John Brown was every plantation owner's worst nightmare. While Brown captured the armory and the town with no resistance, he blundered by allowing a single train of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad to pass through the town unmolested. The train dutifully stopped at the next station, which still had its telegraph wires intact, and sent a missive to their headquarters in Baltimore. The news quickly reached nearby Washington, D.C., and a contingent of Marines was dispatched to capture John Brown. The Marines, under the leadership of one Robert E. Lee, surrounded John Brown and captured him in just 3 minutes. Brown was arrested, despite protesting that he would rather die than being taken in. While he was shot, none of the bullets were fatal. Brown was quickly tried and convicted of treason and sentenced to death. The date of his execution was December 2nd, 1859, mere weeks after the failed raid. John Brown's last words were, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Brown was forced to ride atop his own coffin on the way to the gallows, where he was hanged at 11:15 a.m. John Brown was pronounced dead 35 minutes later by the coroner. Less than 2 months after the raid at Harper's Ferry, John Brown was dead. Tried, convicted, and executed, all in brisk and efficient order. Another case worth referencing is the execution of one William Bruce Mumford in 1862. In May of 1862, Union naval forces landed at New Orleans and seized the city in short order. The Union had always vastly outclassed the Confederacy in terms of naval assets, and the South had no defense against the well-organized coastal raids and amphibious invasions of the North. Union forces entered the town and ordered that all Confederate flags be removed from important government buildings, such as the local mint. These actions angered pro-Confederate citizens who protested in the streets. During the protests, William Bruce Mumford climbed up and tore down the Union flag. Mumford then carried the flag to the mayor of the city and presented it to him. It seemed like a simple act of protest in a dire situation. But on May 1st, 1862, Union Major General Benjamin Butler saw Mumford wearing a piece of the flag as a badge of honor and decided that such insolence could not go unpunished. Mumford was arrested on orders of Butler, who was now the leader of the city under wartime martial law. Mumford was charged with, quote, "high crimes and misdemeanors against the laws of the United States and the peace and dignity thereof and the law martial," and he was sentenced to death. On June 7th, Mumford was hanged in the courtyard of the Mint, where he had ripped down the flag. Mumford was a veteran, and he invoked what he saw as the true spirit of the United States during his final remarks, and upheld that his patriotism for the Confederacy was justified. He was hanged by the neck until dead. Again, less than 2 months after being arrested, Mumford met his final end at the hands of the Union. Lastly, we must look at the most recent executions for treason against the United States in the case of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, commonly known as the Rosenbergs. During the emotional start of the Cold War, the Rosenbergs were accused of spying for the Soviet Union. The couple, married for 11 years at the time of their arrest, was accused of passing along U.S. military and technological secrets, including information about American radar and sonar, along with plans for advanced jet propulsion engines and nuclear weapons designs. The Rosenbergs had managed to recruit sources working on the Manhattan Project during World War II, and had passed along vital nuclear information to the Soviets. During their trial, they were given the death penalty, because their actions were perceived to have gravely harmed the security and safety of the United States. They were even blamed for the American casualties suffered as a part of the Korean War. The judge, during the sentencing, said in part, quote, "I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but that millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country." The pair was arrested in 1950, convicted in 1951, and executed in 1953. They were sent to the electric chair, where they were shocked until dead. If the indirect cause of 50,000 American casualties in Korea warranted the death penalty, what did 642,427 Union casualties including 110,000 dead, warrant for Jefferson Davis. Let us rewind back to May of 1865, when Jefferson Davis had just been arrested for treason and in connection to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. As we have seen, there was ample precedent at the time for a speedy trial and execution. Many believed that Davis would be hanged by the end of the summer. Davis was quickly marched to Fort Monroe in Virginia, one of the Union's most formidable fortresses, which had managed to hold out for the entire Civil War. Davis was placed into a casemate, a dank cement room which was designed to store volatile gunpowder and cannonballs. He was placed under guard morning and night, forced to eat meager meals, and was not allowed to leave the room. Initially, he was even placed in clunky iron fetters, which bound his ankles. He was allowed no visitors, not even supervised visits by his wife. A close eye was kept on him to ensure that he did not attempt to escape, contact any sympathizers, or commit suicide. During his imprisonment in the uncomfortable casemate, Davis kept up his spirits by planning for his eventual trial. Against all common sense, Davis was actually looking forward to his trial. He was relishing it. Davis believed that a public trial would give him the best and last chance to defend his views. Davis vehemently believed in the right of secession. He believed that the initial act of secession on the part of the South was legally valid. A trial would give him the perfect opportunity to defend himself, not to the courts, which he cared little for, but to the American people as a whole. The government knew of Davis's plans for a grand display at his trial and was immediately wary. Some feared that allowing Davis to speak would reignite the embers of the Civil War, which were still scorchingly hot. Would letting Davis speak at a trial be akin to letting Mark Antony speak after the death of Julius Caesar? The government was loath to find out. After a few months in solitary confinement, Davis was allowed to read more materials than just his Bible. Newspapers and books were brought in at his request. Then Davis was allowed to leave the casemate for exercise, including walks by the water. Finally, in early 1866, he was allowed to see his wife, Verena, again. Then, in September of 1866, Davis was permitted to live under house arrest in a 4-room apartment with his wife. Public sentiment was changing. Instead of viewing Davis as a traitor needing to be hanged immediately, many now saw him as a prisoner. Indeed, even a political prisoner who deserved to be treated like an aristocrat or a proud fallen enemy. Keeping Davis in irons and under guard was unbefitting to the class and character of the newly reunited United States of America. This was a rapid and surprising change of heart for those in the North who were previously seen as bitter enemies of the South. With the change in public sentiment and the knowledge that Davis was both an expert orator and deft politician, new questions were raised about how exactly to try Davis. Unlike those who were executed previously, the public profile of Jefferson Davis would not allow for a quick trial. Any trial for Davis, or Lee, or any other high-profile Confederate figure, was guaranteed to be a circus. Any attempts to try Davis, despite the fact that his crimes seemed obvious and his case open and shut, would have to be handled carefully. The question about what to do with Jefferson Davis was an interesting one. Looking back, it seems obvious that the President of the Confederate States of America should have been put quickly on trial for treason, but President Andrew Johnson puzzled over the issue for months. Johnson was a suspected Southern sympathizer, and he was torn about what to do with Davis. The initial charges brought against Davis implicated him in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Those charges were now defunct, as John Wilkes Booth had been captured, and no links could be drawn between the disgruntled actor and the Southern president. Then, it was floated that Davis should be charged by a military tribunal for war crimes, specifically the mistreatment of American prisoners at the Andersonville prison in Georgia, but again, no definitive link between Davis and the charges could be found. Trying Davis unsuccessfully would have been a travesty, and the government could not risk an acquittal in any type of courtroom. Frustrated with Johnson's inability to make a decision regarding the fate of Jefferson Davis, Congress passed a resolution in June of 1866 calling for Davis to be tried for treason. The resolution passed resoundingly, the vote of 105 in favor to 19 opposed. But questions persisted. Davis's lawyers already postulated that Davis could not be charged with treason because he had forsaken his U.S. citizenship during secession. His native Mississippi was no longer a part of the United States when Davis was tapped to become the president of the Confederacy, so he was not liable for treason. Again, these arguments sent jolts of fear through the government that a trial would give legal validity to the idea of secession. The Union had just fought the bloodiest war in American history to prove once and for all that secession was not valid. They could not risk having that statement undone in a courtroom by lawyers and orators. Meanwhile, some rowdy Northerners, veterans, and freemen began singing a ditty, which had the lyrics, "Oh, we'll hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree." This song proved to be problematic, as it spoke to a deep anger and a thirst for vengeance on the part of some living in the Union. On the one hand, the government wondered if they hanged Jefferson Davis, if it would be the end of it all. However, there was always the worry that Jefferson Davis would only be the start. Would those singing the lyrics, "Oh, we'll hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree," then demand to hang every person who had participated in the rebellion? In that case, the United States could easily slide into a period not all that dissimilar to the Terror, which had gripped France during the French Revolution. Would suspected ex-Confederates be dragged into the public square and hanged, one after another, until there were none left? That was a situation that the United States could not abide. Such a broad reprisal could kick off a guerrilla movement in the South, which was already being watched closely with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Or worse, it could reignite a war. If the South believed that their fate was death, and that there was no hope for amnesty or clemency, why not continue fighting? Despite their misgivings, Congress mandated that Davis be charged, so he was indicted. With an official indictment on the books, the time came to transfer Jefferson Davis to civilian custody. Up until this point, Davis was in military custody. Now the legal system demanded that Davis be given his rights as due to him as a United States citizen. Remember, the United States had to treat Davis like a citizen because treating him like a foreign combatant would give life to his arguments that he wasn't a U.S. citizen under the guise of secession. Therefore, Davis was allowed to be released on bail and to wait to stand trial like any regular citizen would be. On May 13, 1867, Davis was transferred to civilian custody and offered bail of $100,000, roughly $2 million today. Davis's bail was raised by prominent citizens in the Union, including the likes of Cornelius Vanderbilt and Horace Greeley, who were eager to see due process seen out. Many in the Union now wanted to show that their system, the rightful legal system, was legitimate and robust. Allowing Davis to be treated properly and given his rights was a vindication of the American system, which was to be contrasted against Davis's vision of the legal system, which claimed that secession was legitimate and legal. Upon his release, Davis immediately traveled to Quebec, where he was reunited with his children and other members of his family who had fled, fearing reprisals from the United States. Davis was allowed to remain in Quebec while the government prepared its case. He was kept under watch to ensure that he did not flee further or attempt to contact anyone in the South. He did neither. Jefferson Davis continued to believe that his fate demanded that he give an account for himself in a courtroom, and he was eager to unleash his legal arguments and deepest convictions before his peers. The government asked for multiple delays in the trial as they prepared their case. They were gathering evidence to show that Davis provided arms and orders for the southern invasion of Union territory in Maryland and Pennsylvania. They were afraid that Davis would argue that the war was purely defensive, and that he only armed his armies for the purpose of defending southern territory. The fact that Confederate armies crossed the border into the Union gave them legal license to charge Davis with treason. But the underlying legal questions about secession and the uniqueness of Davis's character and position continued to bewilder the Union lawyers. The trial was delayed from 1867 to 1868, and then it was delayed again into 1869. Meanwhile, questions about Johnson's fitness for office, the state of the South, and the ultimate goal of Reconstruction were being hotly debated. There were two leading factions in the Reconstruction debate. On the one side, there were those who wanted to see the South made whole. If America was to heal completely from her wounds, the South would have to be reintegrated into the Union with a light touch. Southerners had to be treated like Americans again, and efforts on both sides would have to be made to put a balm on the gaping wound that was now threatening to fester. On the other side, there were those who wanted to see the South punished. These were the people who were singing, "Oh, we'll hang Jeff Davis from a sour apple tree." Ultimately, the Reconciliation faction won out, and on Christmas Day, 1868, President Johnson gave a general pardon to everyone who had been involved with the Civil War. The pardon read, Quote, "The United States offers, unconditionally and without reservation, a full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States or of adhering to their enemies during the late Civil War, with restoration of all rights, privileges, and immunities under the Constitution and the laws." Those who accepted the pardon were required to sign a pledge, which read, quote, "I do solemnly swear or affirm in the presence of Almighty God that I will henceforth faithfully support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of States thereunder, and that I will, in like manner, abide by and faithfully support all laws and proclamations which have been made during the existing rebellion with reference to the emancipation of slaves. So help me God." At first, some didn't know if such a blanket pardon was legal, or if it applied to high-ranking officials like Davis or Lee. While the pardon went out with the hopes of finally putting the Civil War in the rearview mirror, the government continued to prepare its case against Jefferson Davis. Then, on February 15, 1869, the Attorney General of the United States issued a nolle prosequi for Jefferson Davis, a decision not to prosecute. In total, the government dropped 37 indictments for treason against a slew of high-ranking Confederate officials, including Robert E. Lee. With President Johnson's pardon making waves and the persistent fear of giving Davis a soapbox from which to preach about the righteousness of secession, the government ultimately decided to drop all charges. One of the things that clouded the case against Davis was the reluctance on the part of Chief Justice Salmon Chase to prosecute the case. Chief Justice Chase's attitude was part of the reason that the proceedings had been drawn out for so long. It was later found that Chase had aspirations to run for president after Andrew Johnson, and that he had private correspondence with Davis's legal team. It seems as though Salmon Chase was afraid that prosecuting Jefferson would damage his prospects at rising to the office of the president. The other judge on the case was a radical Republican, John C. Underwood, who was eager to see Davis brought to justice. So the legal environment on the Union side was fractured and tainted by politics and partisan loyalties, which ultimately undermined the case. The last thing that influenced the decision on the part of the government to forego prosecuting Davis was the fact that the trial was slated to take place in Richmond, Virginia. The government remained terrified of an acquittal, which was seen as potentially worse than not charging him at all. No one knew what a Richmond jury would rule in such a case, and many were convinced that the citizens of Richmond would acquit Davis just to stick it to the Union. Davis had been extremely popular in Richmond and had garnered the sympathies of large numbers of average Southern citizens. Trying Davis in Richmond was extremely risky, but moving the trial somewhere else, like New York or Washington, would have been decried as unfair and a bid for the case to be weighted against Davis. With all of these things in mind, it was determined that dropping the charges was the best decision. Jefferson Davis was a free man. Not only did Jefferson Davis escape the noose, but he also never made it to trial. For a man who literally led a rebellion against the United States and waged a war that resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties, this is a stunning outcome. While the government dodged the media and legal circus that was inevitable with the Jefferson Davis trial, they still managed to get their legal assurance that secession was invalid and would never be a valid part of the democratic discourse in the nation again. The United States pursued 2 cases in the coming years aimed at dismantling secession for good, without giving Davis a platform. The first case, Texas v. White in April of 1869, stated succinctly but firmly that the Confederacy secession had been, quote, absolutely null. A second case, in 1877, Williams v. Bruffy, elaborated further on secession's illegality, with a thorough examination by the court. These rulings remain the current authority on the status of secession in American law. Secession remains illegal, and the basis of this legal foundation was established by these 2 cases, and not United States v. Davis. But what about Jefferson Davis himself? What did he do with his newfound freedom? What kind of life was in store for the ex-president of the Confederate States of America? Unsurprisingly, Jefferson Davis entered his new life both broke and as an enigmatic figure. His legal fees, combined with the fact that he had generated no income for himself for multiple years, had left him hard up for money. It was time to find a job. But what kind of job could the leader of a breakaway state hope to get? Davis was offered multiple positions by universities across the South, but he turned them all down. In some cases, he felt the salary too low, and in other cases, he said that he didn't want his person to hinder or damage the reputation of the school in question. The reality was that Davis, always a Southern aristocrat, saw himself as above menial work. He viewed himself as a war veteran of the Mexican-American War, a former U.S. Senator, and a former president. Other men in his position were not forced to work for a living, so why should he? After turning down teaching positions, he tried to find employment in Europe and failed. Ultimately, he had to return to the United States and take an insurance job to try to make ends meet. After a decade of wandering the face of the earth, going to and fro, Davis finally received an offer that he felt was befitting of his station. In 1877, a Southern author by the name of Sarah Dorsey offered him a residence at her estate, Beauvoir, in Biloxi, Mississippi. She offered to sponsor Davis so that he could write his memoirs. It was an offer that he accepted, to the chagrin of his wife, who believed that Dorsey had ulterior motives for her largesse. Davis ultimately moved to Beauvoir and became an author. He wasn't able to make his grand statement on secession in the court, but now he used the pen to write out his position in a volume entitled The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government. When Dorsey died, she entrusted the estate to Davis, and the home remains linked to his person to this day. You can still visit Beauvoir and Biloxi and see the home for yourself. Finally, in the final years of his life, Davis was called out of exile and was asked to return to the public light once more. Jefferson Davis was asked to be present at various ceremonies and monument raisings to remember the Civil War. The 20th anniversary of the start of the war was approaching, and many were eager to tout Davis as an example of the healing that the country had experienced. Not only was Davis still alive, but he was now a regular American citizen, an example of how the country was coming back together and healing. Thousands of people turned out to see Davis as he toured the South. Some were veterans who wanted to pay respects to their former leader. Others were simply curious to see the face of the man who had waged war against the United States. It was a final hurrah for Davis, who managed to pass from this life to the next with an amount of respect and dignity that many would have thought unthinkable a decade prior. Jefferson Davis died on December 9th, 1889, after outliving Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and Ulysses S. Grant. He died of bronchitis after riding on a steamboat in the rain during one of his tours. The saga surrounding the late life of Jefferson Davis, including his imprisonment, a trial that never was, and the inexplicable fact that he escaped execution, remain a fascinating and relatively unknown part of American history. Was it wrong to deny Americans the justice they sought in a trial of Davis? Were the concerns of the government about giving Davis such a broad platform to speak overblown? Did letting Davis walk really help the country heal after a brutal civil war? Should Jefferson Davis have been hanged for his crimes? That is up to those in the present to debate amongst themselves, as history was already written, forgotten, and now found. Hey everybody, thank you for listening to Forgotten and Found. We hope to catch you next time. If you like what you heard and want to hear more, be sure to hit that subscribe button and follow wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to read more of my writing on hundreds of unique history topics, be sure to head over to grantpiperwriting.medium.com. Again, that's grantpiperwriting.medium.com, and catch new episodes of Forgotten and Found every Monday. For those of you who are already here, we are getting in on the ground floor of something that I am truly excited about. 2025 is going to be a phenomenal year for Forgotten and Found, and I am happy to have you along for the ride. I'm your host, Grant Piper. Be good and God bless.